The rain poured down mercilessly, drenching the streets in darkness. A tiny, trembling puppy limped through the alley, its ribs pressing against its thin skin. Just as it stumbled toward a trash can, hoping for a scrap of food, a sudden kick sent it flying. A sharp yelp echoed through the night, but no one stopped. No one cared, except for one boy. Ethan stood frozen under the dim glow of a street lamp, his fists clenched. His life was already filled with pain, but as he looked into the puppy's broken eyes, he knew, somehow, they were the same. What unfolds next will touch your soul. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Share your thoughts in the comments and join us on this heartfelt journey. May this story bring warmth and hope to your heart. Now, let's begin. The rain was relentless, drumming against the pavement in an endless, merciless rhythm. The streets shimmered under the dim glow of flickering streetlights, the reflections distorted by pools of water collecting in the cracks of the worn asphalt. The city felt hollow, void of warmth, as if the downpour had washed away every trace of kindness. In a narrow, filthy alley, a tiny puppy lay curled against the cold brick wall, its frail body trembling. Its fur, once golden, was now matted and caked in dirt. Hunger gnawed at its belly, twisting like an unseen claw, while exhaustion made its legs weak and unsteady. It had been wandering for what felt like forever, abandoned in a world too cruel to care. Its mother was gone. Its siblings, if they had ever existed, were only a faint memory. All it knew now was the ache of loneliness and the sharp pangs of hunger. Desperation outweighed fear as the puppy forced itself to move, dragging its tiny body toward the scattered trash bags a few feet away. The scent of rotting food filled its nose, making its stomach clench with painful longing. It pushed its snout forward, nudging a discarded carton with what little strength it had left. Maybe, just maybe, there was something inside. Then it happened. A boot swung out of the darkness, striking the puppy with brutal force. The impact sent the tiny creature flying, its fragile body landing with a sickening thud against the wet pavement. A sharp, pained yelp tore through the alley, drowned by the heavy rain. "Filthy mutt," the man muttered, pulling his coat tighter around himself as he stepped over the trembling pup. He didn't spare it another glance. The puppy lay still, the world spinning in dizzying, painful waves. Its ribs ached with every breath. Its ears rang and its vision blurred. Why? Why did it deserve this? Why had the world cast it aside like trash, unwanted and unloved? It didn't know how long it lay there, rainwater seeping into its fur, mixing with the grime and the pain. The darkness felt endless, and for the first time, it wondered if it should stop trying, stop fighting against a fate that had already been decided for it. Then footsteps, soft, hesitant, not the heavy, indifferent strides of adults. No, these were lighter, slower, almost cautious. A boy stood under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, watching. He couldn't have been more than 12. His clothes were damp and patched in places, the edges of his oversized jacket frayed. His face was pale beneath the shadows of his hood, and his eyes, dark, quiet, held a sadness that didn't belong to a child. Ethan had seen suffering before. He had felt it in ways too deep to explain, too tangled in silence to be spoken aloud. And now he saw it again, reflected in the broken eyes of the tiny creature at his feet. The puppy flinched when he crouched down, its body curling in on itself, bracing for another strike. But none came. Instead, small, cold hands reached out, hesitated for a moment, then gently scooped the trembling pup into their warmth. The puppy was so light, so fragile, that Ethan felt something in his chest tighten painfully. He had seen stray dogs before. Some ran in packs, surviving off scraps and instinct. Others were stronger, tougher, fighters hardened by the streets. But this one was just a baby who had already learned that humans could be cruel. Ethan glanced around, as if expecting someone to yell at him, to take the puppy away, to tell him he wasn't allowed to care. But the streets remained empty, save for the ceaseless rain. "It's okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the puppy or to himself. "I won't hurt you." The puppy whimpered, its tiny body pressed against his chest, its heartbeat faint but desperate. Ethan hesitated only for a second longer before pulling his tattered jacket tighter around both of them. He straightened, ignoring the cold seeping into his skin, and turned toward home. It wasn't much, a small, cluttered apartment where his grandfather spent most days in his worn-out recliner, staring at the television with weary eyes. There wasn't always enough food. There wasn't always enough warmth. But it was the only home he had, and now it would be home for the puppy too. As Ethan walked through the rain, the puppy buried its head against his chest, too weak to do anything else. Its breaths were shallow, uneven, but for the first time in its short life there was someone, holding it close. Maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't entirely cruel. Maybe for the first time it wasn't alone. The apartment was small, old, and smelled faintly of dust and coffee. The wallpaper had begun peeling at the corners, and the radiator rattled every time the heat kicked in, though it rarely worked the way it should. The space was cluttered but not messy, filled with relics of a life that once had more to it. Ethan stepped inside carefully, his wet shoes squeaking against the worn wooden floor. The dim glow of a table lamp cast long shadows across the room, stretching toward the recliner in the corner, where his grandfather, Henry, sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the old television set. Henry was a man of quiet strength. His once broad shoulders had curved inward with age, and his hair, what remained of it, was a thin, silver halo around his head. The deep lines on his face weren't just from time, but from battles fought, both in war and in life. He heard the door close and turned his gaze toward Ethan. His sharp blue eyes narrowed when he saw what the boy was cradling in his arms. "What's that?" His voice was gruff, but not unkind. Ethan hesitated. The puppy was still shivering, barely clinging to warmth. He could feel its heartbeat against his chest, rapid and weak. "I found him," Ethan said simply. "He was in the alley. Someone hurt him." Henry sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Ethan, we've talked about this before. We can barely afford to feed ourselves, let alone a dog." Ethan swallowed hard. He knew. He knew they were struggling. He knew that every meal was measured, that the bills came in stacks, and that Henry spent more nights staring at them in silence than Ethan wanted to admit. But none of that mattered right now. The puppy had no one, and deep down, Ethan understood what that felt like better than anyone. "Just for tonight," Ethan pleaded. "Please. He won't make it out there in this rain." Henry exhaled slowly, his gaze lingering on the small, fragile creature tucked against Ethan's chest. There was a long silence, one so thick it felt like it stretched through time itself. Then, finally, "Fine," Henry muttered. "One night." Relief flooded Ethan's chest. But he didn't let it show. Instead, he nodded and moved quickly, heading towards the small corner of his room, where an old blanket lay folded on the floor. He knelt down, carefully setting the puppy onto the soft fabric. The puppy whimpered, curling into itself. Ethan reached out and gently ran a hand over its damp fur. "You're safe now," he whispered. The puppy didn't respond, but its breathing steadied, if only a little. Henry from the doorway watched in silence. His expression was unreadable, but for the briefest moment, a shadow of something flickered across his face, something distant, something that looked like remembrance. A name, a bond. By morning, the rain had stopped. The world outside was painted in dull greys, the air still thick with the scent of damp pavement. Ethan woke to find the puppy curled up against his side, its tiny body warm and soft. A small, unexpected smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Buddy," he murmured. The puppy stirred at the sound of his voice, lifting its head slightly, its dark eyes peering up at him. Ethan grinned. "That's what I'll call you, Buddy." The name felt right, like a promise, like family. Over the next few days, despite Henry's initial resistance, Buddy became a part of their routine. Ethan would sneak bits of his own food under the table, pretending he wasn't as hungry as he actually was. At night, Buddy would curl up beside him, pressing against his chest like a heartbeat he never wanted to lose. Even Henry, though he never admitted it, had softened. Ethan caught him once, just once, reaching down to scratch Buddy behind the ears when he thought no one was looking. And for the first time in a long time, the apartment didn't feel quite so empty. A hidden truth. But Ethan carried a secret, a truth he hadn't spoken aloud even to himself, because deep down he knew he wouldn't be able to keep Buddy forever. Something was coming, something he had no control over. And no matter how tightly he held on, no matter how much he wanted to believe that Buddy was his to keep. Fate had a way of taking things away, things you loved, things you needed, things you thought would never leave. And the worst part? He had no idea when it would happen or how much it would hurt when it did. But what happens when the one thing you love most is the one thing you can't hold on to forever? The days passed in quiet, fragile harmony. Ethan had mastered the art of sacrifice long before Buddy arrived. Hunger was nothing new. He had learned to ignore the dull ache in his stomach, to pretend he wasn't as hungry as he actually was. It was easier that way, easier than admitting how much their lives were stretched thin, held together by threadbare patience and unspoken struggles. But Buddy didn't understand sacrifice. The puppy only knew warmth, safety, and the quiet comfort of being wanted, for the first time in its life. So Ethan made sure it stayed that way. At dinner, when Henry wasn't looking, Ethan would sneak small pieces of his food under the table. Buddy, ever trusting, would lap them up with gentle eagerness, never questioning why Ethan's own plate was always left nearly empty. At night, when the apartment turned silent and the world outside felt too big, Buddy curled against Ethan's chest, his tiny breaths steady and warm. Ethan would hold him close, listening to the rhythmic rise and fall of his little body, pretending just for a moment that they could stay like this forever. But deep down, Ethan knew better than to believe in forever. A glimpse into the past. Henry never said it outright, but something had shifted. At first, he had tolerated Buddy's presence with mild irritation, muttering under his breath about one more mouth to feed. But over time, his sharp edges softened. One evening, Ethan caught him sitting in his recliner, staring into the dim glow of the lamp, with a faraway look in his eyes. Buddy, half asleep on the floor, perked up when Henry reached down, absent-mindedly running his fingers through the pup's soft fur. "You remind me of another dog I once knew," Henry murmured, his voice quieter than usual. Ethan sat up, surprised. "You had a dog?" Henry exhaled, his fingers pausing against Buddy's fur. "A long time ago." It was rare for Henry to talk about the past, even rarer for him to let the weight of old memories surface. "I was in the army. Had a dog named Ranger," he continued, almost reluctantly. "He was tough, brave, the best damn partner a man could ask for." Ethan waited, sensing that there was more. Henry's fingers twitched slightly, as if recalling the feel of a different coat, a different heartbeat against his hand. "He saved my life once," Henry said, his voice laced with something unreadable, more than once, actually. Ethan didn't ask what happened to Ranger. He didn't need to. The way Henry's jaw clenched, the way his hand stilled against Buddy's fur was enough. Some losses never faded, and some wounds, no matter how much time passed, never truly healed. A moment of happiness. For the first time in a long time, things felt okay. Not perfect, not easy, but okay. Buddy was growing stronger. His once weak legs now carried him with playful confidence. His ribs were no longer visible beneath his fur. He was learning to trust, to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't only filled with cruelty. One afternoon, Ethan took him to the park. It wasn't much, just a small, worn-down patch of grass, surrounded by rusted benches and an old swing set. But to Buddy it was everything. He ran, ears flopping, tail wagging, as if he had never known pain. Ethan watched, smiling despite himself. For a moment it was easy to forget everything else. The hunger, the worry, the gnawing weight of uncertainty that never fully left Ethan's chest. But then, The thought crept in. Dark, unwelcome, inevitable. Ethan's smile faded as he watched Buddy chase a butterfly, his small paws kicking up patches of dirt. Buddy was happy, but happiness had a way of slipping through your fingers when you held on too tightly. Ethan swallowed hard. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, as if trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. Maybe we can't be together forever. The words were barely a whisper, lost in the autumn breeze. Buddy didn't hear them. Or maybe he did, because for the briefest moment, he stopped chasing the butterfly and looked back at Ethan, tilting his head as if sensing something unspoken. But then, as quickly as it came, the moment passed. Buddy wagged his tail and bounded toward him, his tongue lolling in a happy pant, unaware of the storm brewing in Ethan's chest. Because Buddy didn't know that happiness was fragile, that nothing in Ethan's life had ever stayed, didn't know that one way or another. All good things had to come to an end. But what happens when you realize love isn't enough to stop fate? The knock on the door came in the middle of the afternoon. It was sharp, purposeful. Ethan barely glanced up from where he sat on the floor, tossing a crumpled sock for Buddy to chase. The pup, now stronger and more playful, pounced with a happy bark, his tail wagging wildly. Henry, who had been dozing in his recliner, stirred at the sound. His brows furrowed as he let out a tired sigh, pushing himself up with effort. "I got it," he grumbled, his joints creaking as he shuffled toward the door. Ethan turned back to Buddy, laughing softly as the pup wrestled the sock between his tiny teeth. For once, things felt normal, simple, safe. Then Henry opened the door, and the world shifted. The past comes knocking. She stood there in a perfectly pressed coat, her heels clicking slightly as she shifted her weight. Her hair was sleek, her makeup flawless, but none of it could hide the coldness in her eyes. The moment Ethan saw her, his breath caught in his throat. His mother. She hadn't changed much, still polished, still distant, still a stranger. Henry's expression darkened. "What do you want?" She ignored him, her gaze settling on Ethan like he was a misplaced item she had just remembered she owned. "It's time for you to come home," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. Ethan stiffened. "Home?" The word felt foreign in his mouth. Henry stepped between them. "He is home." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Legally, he isn't." The words hit like a punch. Ethan's stomach twisted as she pulled out a neatly folded stack of papers from her handbag, custody papers. She had never wanted him before, never looked for him, never cared. But now she had the law on her side, and no matter how much Henry fought, how much Ethan pleaded, there was nothing they could do. The breaking of a bond. Ethan didn't pack much. There wasn't much to take. A few clothes, a book Henry had given him, and Buddy. But the moment he reached for Buddy's leash, his mother sighed. "The dog stays." Ethan froze. "No, he's mine. He's family." She didn't even blink. "I'm not taking care of a stray." Buddy, sensing the tension, pressed himself against Ethan's leg, his ears flattening. Henry clenched his jaw. "He needs his dog. You took everything else. Let him have this." But she had already turned away, and the world didn't care about what Ethan needed. The last goodbye. The car door slammed shut. Ethan sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his hands clenched so tightly his nails bit into his palms. Buddy stood on the curb, his paws shifting anxiously, his eyes locked onto Ethan through the window. Then the engine roared to life, and Buddy panicked. He bolted forward, barking wildly, chasing the car as it pulled away from the only home he had ever known. "Buddy, no!" Ethan twisted in his seat, his heart slamming against his ribs. The pup ran with everything he had, his small legs struggling to keep up with the speed of the car. The road was slick from last night's rain, the world blurred by motion. "Stop the car!" Ethan begged, but his mother didn't even glance his way. Buddy's frantic barks grew fainter. His little body slowed. Then, finally, he stumbled to a stop, his tiny frame heaving. Ethan could barely see him now, just a small, golden blur, growing smaller and smaller in the distance. He pressed his palms against the glass, his vision clouded by tears. "I'm sorry, Buddy," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Buddy stood alone in the middle of the road, ears perked, tail low, waiting, hoping, even as the car disappeared, taking his best friend away. But what happens to a dog who has nothing left but the promise of a love that was torn away? The world was cruel to those who had no place in it. Buddy waited for days. He stayed in the same spot where he had last seen Ethan, pacing back and forth on the road, ears perked at every car that passed. His tail would wag hesitantly at the sound of footsteps, only for his hope to shatter when none of them belonged to the boy he loved. The cold crept in, the hunger returned, and eventually reality set in. Ethan wasn't coming back, so Buddy did what he had done once before. He wandered. A fighter without a fight. At first he searched, through the streets, behind buildings, sniffing the air for any trace of Ethan's scent. But the city was vast, and Buddy was small. Days turned into weeks. The hunger sharpened, a relentless ache that refused to leave. Rainstorms soaked his fur, turning his body into a trembling, shivering mess. But this time, Buddy wasn't the same weak, helpless pup from before. He had learned how to survive. He found food where he could, scraps near dumpsters, stolen bites when no one was looking. He learned which streets to avoid, which people were kind and which weren't. But even the strongest strays had their limits. One evening, as Buddy sniffed around the back of a market, a hand suddenly grabbed him by the scruff. "Gotcha, mutt!" a voice sneered. Buddy thrashed, barking in panic, but the grip was too strong. A rough sack was thrown over him, plunging him into darkness. And just like that, he was taken. The underground pit. When the sack was pulled away, Buddy found himself inside a cramped metal cage. The air was thick with the scent of blood, fear, and unwashed fur. Dogs surrounded him, some large, scarred from battles, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Others were young, trembling in the corners of their cages. The men who ran the place laughed as they shoved Buddy toward the center of a dirt-covered pit. They wanted him to fight. Another dog was released, a snarling, desperate mutt whose ribs stuck out like jagged knives beneath his fur. He lunged, teeth bared. Buddy could have fought. He could have bit back, defended himself, but he didn't. Instead, he stood still. His ears flattened, his tail lowered, and he backed away slowly, refusing to be part of the violence. The men cursed. They shouted, throwing things at him, but Buddy wouldn't move. He wouldn't become like them, and for that he paid the price. A desperate escape. One night, when the guards grew careless, Buddy seized his chance. The gate had been left unlatched just slightly, enough for a desperate dog to push through. His legs were weak, his body ached, but he ran. He ran like he had never run before. Shouts rang behind him. Flashlights swung wildly in the dark. A sharp pain ripped through his side as something heavy struck him, a thrown object, a cruel punishment for his escape. Buddy stumbled. The world spun. His vision blurred as he collapsed onto the cold pavement, gasping for air. For the first time he felt like giving up. Until footsteps, slow, steady footsteps. Buddy forced his eyes open, his body too weak to move. A pair of worn boots stopped beside him. A familiar scent, faint, buried beneath years of time and loss, drifted through the air, and then a voice, low, gravelly, filled with something that almost sounded like disbelief. "Buddy?" Through the haze of pain, Buddy's tail gave the smallest, weakest wag. The world had taken so much from him, but somehow, it had led him back to Henry. But after everything Buddy has been through, is it too late for him to find his way home? The cold night pressed against the city like an unshakable weight. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flickering street lamp casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Henry had walked these streets many times before, but tonight felt different. The burden in his chest wasn't just the biting chill. It was the sight of the broken creature lying before him. Buddy. The dog barely moved, his frail body trembling with exhaustion and pain. His fur, once golden and full of life, was now dull, matted with dirt and dried blood. His ribs jutted out sharply, his breath coming in slow, shallow pants. Henry knelt beside him, the weight of old age pressing heavily on his joints, but he ignored it. His fingers hesitated for just a moment before he reached out, brushing against Buddy's fur. The dog flinched. Henry exhaled slowly. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice rough from years of hardship, softened in a way it rarely did. "It's just me." For a moment there was nothing, just the sound of the distant wind, the dim hum of the city, and the slowing heartbeat of a dog who had already lost too much. Then, a small, broken whimper. Buddy barely lifted his head, his glazed eyes meeting Henry's for just a second before sinking shut again. Henry clenched his jaw. "Come on now, we're not done yet," he muttered, shifting his weight and carefully sliding his arms beneath Buddy's frail body. The dog was light, too light. Henry held him close and pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the way his bones protested the movement. It wasn't the first time he'd carried a soul on the edge of life, but this time he refused to lose. Bringing him home. The walk back to the apartment was long. Every step was a battle against time, against the past, against fate itself. By the time Henry pushed open the door, his breath was uneven, his arms aching from the weight of Buddy and the weight of something heavier, memories he had long buried. The apartment was warm, the scent of old books and coffee lingering in the air. He carefully set Buddy down on the worn couch, pulling a frayed blanket over the trembling pup. Buddy didn't move. His body was still, too still. Henry pressed a hand against his side, feeling the slow, fragile rise and fall of his ribs. Still breathing. That was enough, for now. A fragile recovery. Days passed in slow, careful moments. Henry nursed Buddy the only way he knew how, with quiet patience and stubborn resilience. He cleaned the pup's wounds, warmed him by the fireplace, fed him what little food he could spare. He spoke to him in hushed tones, as if trying to convince them both that everything would be okay. But Buddy had lost something deeper than just his strength. His eyes, once bright with curiosity, now held nothing but emptiness. He no longer wagged his tail, no longer perked his ears at the sound of a voice. He would eat when food was placed before him, but there was no eagerness, no spark of life. It was as if the world had finally beaten him into submission, and Henry knew what that felt like. Echoes of the past. One night, as the snow fell softly outside, Henry sat in his recliner, staring at the small bundle of fur curled up by the fire. Buddy lay motionless, the dim glow of the flames casting soft shadows over his fragile frame. Henry exhaled, his breath heavy with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Loss. His hand, rough with age, ran absently over his knee, a knee that had once been strong, unbreakable, a knee that had once knelt beside another dog, a dog with sharp instincts, and a heart that never wavered. Ranger. He hadn't spoken that name in years, but tonight it clawed its way back. "You remind me of him," Henry murmured, his voice thick with something raw. His gaze flickered to Buddy. "Not because you look like him, but because you never stopped fighting." Buddy didn't react, didn't even lift his head. Henry swallowed hard. "You're not the only one who's lost someone, you know," he said, his fingers curling into fists against his knees. "I lost him too. And not just him. I've lost more people than I can count." His throat tightened and he looked away, his gaze settling on the fire. "But the hardest thing is losing someone before you're ready." His voice dropped to a whisper. "And I was never ready." The room was silent. Only the fire crackled softly, filling the emptiness with a warmth that neither of them truly felt. The final farewell. That night Henry barely slept. His body ached more than usual. His breath felt heavier, like it had to fight harder just to keep going. But in the quiet hours before dawn, he stirred one last time. He looked at Buddy, still curled by the fire, still lost somewhere within himself. A faint smile touched Henry's lips. He reached out, his fingers just barely brushing against Buddy's fur, and then, with a slow, weary exhale, he closed his eyes and didn't open them again. The morning that changed everything. The phone rang early. Ethan sat up groggily, blinking at the unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Something in his gut twisted. He hesitated for only a second before answering. "Hello?" A pause. Then, "Ethan." The voice on the other end was strained, unfamiliar yet deeply known. "It's about your grandfather." The world tilted. The words blurred together, distant and cold. "Found this morning. Peaceful. Went in his sleep." Ethan couldn't breathe. His fingers tightened around the phone, his knuckles white. And then, a bark. Faint, weak. Ethan's heart stopped. The voice on the phone continued, but he was no longer listening. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything except for the sound of paws shuffling, claws clicking against the wooden floor. Another bark, louder this time. Ethan's breath hitched. Buddy. Buddy was alive, but Henry was gone. And just like that, everything shattered. The bus ride back home felt endless. Ethan sat with his forehead pressed against the window, watching as the city blurred past him. It didn't feel real. None of it did. Henry was gone. He had known this day would come, had spent years pushing the thought to the back of his mind, but that didn't make it any easier. It didn't make the loss any less crushing. The phone call still echoed in his head, the words, the finality. Went in his sleep. He didn't suffer. Empty phrases meant to offer comfort, but they didn't, because Henry was gone, and for the first time in Ethan's life, he had nowhere to go. Returning to a home that no longer felt like home. The taxi dropped him off in front of the old apartment building. It looked the same. The chipped paint, the rusted railing, the small, cracked window near the entrance. Nothing had changed, except everything had. Ethan took a slow breath and pushed the door open. The air inside was thick with silence. His grandfather's chair sat in the corner, the blanket still draped over the armrest, untouched. The coffee cup on the small table beside it was half full, as if Henry had just been sitting there, just waiting for Ethan to come home. The lump in Ethan's throat tightened. Then, a sound, a soft shuffle, a faint, hesitant step. Ethan turned and his breath caught in his chest. Buddy. The dog stood near the hallway, thin and frail, his golden fur still dull with exhaustion, but his eyes, those deep, dark eyes, lit up the moment they met Ethan's. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, as if something inside him had snapped, Buddy let out a broken, desperate whimper and ran. A love that never left. Ethan barely had time to brace himself before Buddy crashed into him, his paws scrambling against the worn floor as he buried his face against Ethan's chest. Tears burned in Ethan's eyes. He fell to his knees, his arms wrapping around Buddy as tightly as he could. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I'm here, Buddy." Buddy whined, his entire body trembling as he pressed closer, as if afraid Ethan would disappear again. Ethan ran his fingers through the pup's fur, feeling every fragile bone beneath the skin. Buddy had been through hell. He had suffered, starved, waited, but he had never given up. Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers curling into Buddy's fur. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. "I never should have left you. I never should have—" Buddy only licked his face, his tail wagging weakly. There was no anger, no resentment, just love, pure, unconditional love. Ethan tightened his grip, pressing his forehead against Buddy's. "I'm not leaving again," he whispered. "Not this time." Buddy let out a soft sigh, sinking into Ethan's hold. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were together again. But reality loomed just behind that moment of peace. Because the truth was, Ethan had no idea what came next. Nowhere left to go. That night, Ethan sat in Henry's chair, staring at the fireplace. Buddy lay curled up at his feet, his breathing slow and steady. The old blanket Henry always used was draped over Ethan's shoulders, but it did nothing to ease the emptiness in his chest. The house felt too quiet, too still. It wasn't home anymore, and deep down Ethan knew he couldn't stay. The apartment wasn't his. It had been Henry's, and without him there was nothing keeping Ethan here. No money, no family, and no place to belong. He glanced down at Buddy, running a hand absently over the pup's back. "We don't have anywhere to go, do we?" he murmured. Buddy let out a soft breath, shifting closer. Ethan sighed, leaning his head back against the chair. Tomorrow he'd have to figure something out. But for tonight, just for tonight, he let himself hold on to what little he had left, and hope that somehow, some way, they'd find a way to keep going. The weight of uncertainty had always loomed over Ethan's life, a shadow stretching long and cold. But this time something was different. This time he wasn't alone. Buddy lay curled up on the couch beside him, his head resting against Ethan's leg. His ribs were still too prominent, his fur still dull from weeks of hardship, but his eyes held something new, hope. And Ethan? For the first time in a long time, he felt that hope too. Staying behind. The apartment had belonged to Henry. It was small, old, and in desperate need of repairs, but it was the only home Ethan had left. And as he looked around, taking in the faint smell of coffee that still clung to the air, the worn recliner that sat untouched in the corner, he knew he couldn't leave it behind. Not yet. Not when it was the last thing tying him to his grandfather. Henry had raised him here, had scolded him at the kitchen table when he forgot to do his homework, had taught him how to tie a proper knot, how to make pancakes on Sunday mornings. And now Henry was gone, but Buddy was still here, and that had to mean something. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through Buddy's fur. "We're staying," he murmured. Buddy's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, and he lifted his head slightly, his tail giving a weak thump against the couch. Ethan managed a small smile. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing in his life ever had been. Building a life. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, long hours, and quiet determination. Ethan found a part-time job at a nearby diner, bussing tables and washing dishes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the lights on, enough to buy food for both him and Buddy. And most importantly, it was enough to make sure they could stay together. Filing for Buddy's adoption wasn't simple. There were questions, fees, and hoops to jump through, but Ethan didn't care. Buddy wasn't just a pet, he was family. So Ethan did everything. Filling out forms, meeting with officials, making promises he swore he would never break. And the day he received the final paperwork, the confirmation that Buddy was his, truly his, he sat on the floor of the apartment, Buddy in his lap, and let himself cry. Because for the first time in his life, no one could take this away from him. No one could tell him he wasn't allowed to stay. Memories that remain. One evening, as the sky bled into hues of gold and violet, Ethan found himself standing in the doorway of Henry's old bedroom. It had remained untouched since the day he left. Dust coated the shelves, the faint scent of his grandfather's aftershave still lingering in the air. Ethan hesitated, then stepped inside. His fingers traced along the edges of the old wooden dresser, his breath catching as his eyes landed on something small resting atop it. A box. Carefully, he lifted the lid. Inside, neatly tucked away, lay a military medal, Henry's old service medal. Ethan swallowed hard. He had never asked much about Henry's past. His grandfather had been a man of few words, his stories locked away behind a quiet, unreadable gaze. But this had meant something to him, and now it meant something to Ethan too. He picked up the medal, rolling it between his fingers before clenching it tightly in his fist. Buddy sat beside him, watching silently, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Ethan inhaled deeply, his grip tightening. "We're not going to lose each other again," he said, his voice steady. Buddy let out a small, approving bark, his tail wagging just once. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed it. A walk into tomorrow. Life didn't magically become easy. There were still long shifts at the diner, still bills to pay, still days when Ethan missed Henry so much it hurt. But there were also mornings when Buddy would wake him up by licking his face. Afternoons spent playing fetch in the park. Evenings when they sat side by side on the couch, the silence between them no longer feeling lonely. They were building something new, something that belonged to them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and honey, Ethan clipped Buddy's leash onto his collar. "Come on, boy," he said, stepping outside. The air was cool, the wind carrying the last whispers of autumn before winter crept in. Buddy trotted beside him, his steps lighter, more confident than they had been in weeks. Ethan smiled, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets as they walked down the quiet street, the glow of the setting sun casting long shadows behind them. For the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't running away. He wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. He wasn't afraid of what came next, because whatever happened, he and Buddy would face it together, and that was all that mattered. Life has a way of testing us, breaking us, making us believe that we are alone. Ethan knew that pain. So did Buddy. They were both abandoned, cast aside, left to fend for themselves in a world that didn't seem to care. But love has a way of finding its way back to us. God works in ways we may not always understand. Sometimes he takes us through storms, through loss, through trials that feel unbearable, not to break us, but to prepare us, to shape us, to lead us to something greater. Ethan lost his grandfather, but in his loss, he found a purpose. He found the strength to stand on his own, to build a life worth living, and to protect the one soul who had never given up on him, Buddy. And isn't that what love is? He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. That healing doesn't always come the way we expect. Sometimes it comes in the form of an old man who teaches us what home really means. Sometimes it comes in the form of a dog who waits, no matter how long it takes. And sometimes it comes in the quiet moments, when we finally understand that we were never truly alone to begin with. So if you've ever felt abandoned, if you've ever believed that no one sees you, no one cares, know this: God sees you. He has a plan for you, and he will never leave you behind. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us, has an animal ever changed your life? Have you ever witnessed God's love in the smallest, most unexpected ways? Leave a comment, share your story, and let's remind the world that kindness, faith, and love still exist. And remember, you are never forgotten. Every morning, through the biting cold and blistering heat, she walked the same path, 10 miles day after day. She stopped at a familiar doorstep, waiting, hoping. But no one ever came. What was she searching for? And why wouldn't she stop? Her journey seemed endless, until one day a man noticed, a man with his own broken past. Was it fate, or something more? Stay with us as we uncover the heartbreaking truth behind her endless walk and the miracle that changed everything. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale golden hue over the frozen landscape. The wind howled through the barren trees, swirling the loose snow along the desolate road that stretched endlessly through the countryside. It was early morning, yet the world seemed eerily still, except for the rhythmic sound of padded footsteps against the icy pavement. She moved with quiet determination, her lean yet powerful frame cutting through the cold like a shadow. Luna, a German shepherd around 4 years old, bore the strong, elegant build, characteristic of her breed. Muscular shoulders, a proud stance, and a coat of black and tan that had once gleamed with health, but now bore the signs of hardship. Her fur, once thick and glossy, had grown rough and tangled, dusted with frost. The deep brown of her eyes held a haunting sadness, as if carrying the weight of an unfulfilled promise. For the past several months, she had taken the same path, 10 miles each day, a relentless pilgrimage. She did not wander aimlessly. Her journey had a purpose, though no one understood it. The townspeople had begun to notice her, whispering among themselves about the lonely dog that walked the same route every morning, only to disappear into the fading daylight. Luna never strayed, never hesitated. She passed by the gas station at the town's edge, where Sarah, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a kind heart, often stood by the counter watching her. Sarah had lived in this town her entire life. Once a spirited and outgoing woman, time had weathered her into someone more reserved. The loss of her younger brother to a car accident had left her wary of forming deep connections, a wound that never quite healed. Now, she spent her days running the old gas station alone, exchanging pleasantries with customers but never letting anyone too close. She had seen stray dogs before, some passing through, some abandoned, but Luna was different. The dog wasn't searching for food or shelter. She was searching for something, or someone. She passed by again. Sarah muttered under her breath as she wiped down the counter, watching Luna disappear down the road. Where does she go? Further down the stretch of highway, Daniel sat on the porch of his small, weathered cabin, nursing a cup of black coffee. The 52-year-old veteran had broad shoulders and a wiry frame, his once jet-black hair now peppered with streaks of grey. The lines on his face were not just from age, but from a lifetime of battles, both on the field and within himself. Daniel had served 2 decades in the military, surviving more deployments than he cared to count. He had been a leader, a protector, a man who once thrived under pressure, but war had taken its toll. When he returned, he found himself adrift in civilian life, unable to shake the ghosts of his past. His wife had left him years ago, unable to cope with his growing detachment. Now he lived alone, existing rather than truly living. It was during these quiet, solitary mornings that he first noticed her. Every day, without fail, she passed his cabin. He could set his watch by her. The first time he saw her, he thought she was a stray, maybe a lost pet. But then the pattern emerged. Same time, same route. She didn't scavenge, didn't beg, didn't waver. She simply walked. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling a slow breath. He had never been one to concern himself with town gossip, but he found himself thinking about the dog more than he should. What was she looking for? Luna continued down the road, her paws pressing into the frost-covered ground. She knew where she was going. The house came into view, a modest old home with a white wooden fence now splintered with time, a front porch that sagged slightly under the weight of neglect. The windows were dark, silent. Luna stopped at the gate, her breath visible in the crisp air. She stood there for a long moment, unmoving, ears pricked forward, as if expecting to hear the creak of the door, the familiar shuffle of footsteps, the voice that should have been calling her name, but there was nothing. Still she waited. The morning sun climbed higher, casting golden light over the snow-dusted lawn, but Luna remained, her heart caught between past and present, hope and reality. And then, as if something within her had finally whispered, "Not today." She turned and retraced her steps, walking the same road back, her silhouette growing smaller against the vast horizon. From the shadows of his porch, Daniel watched her go, a frown deepening on his face. That dog wasn't lost. She was waiting. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a spark of curiosity, maybe even concern, stir within him. 2 years ago, the town had not yet come to know Luna as the wandering shadow along the frozen roads. She had been something else entirely, a devoted companion, a guardian, and the last remaining piece of a quiet man's world. George had always been a man of structure. A former police officer, he had spent decades upholding the law, his days dictated by discipline and purpose. He was tall, with a lean but sturdy frame, the kind of build that age had begun to wear down, but could not entirely erode. His steel-blue eyes, sharp even in his older years, carried the weight of everything he had seen, the crimes, the broken people, the victories, and the failures. His silver hair was always neatly combed, and even after retirement, he still dressed with care, pressed shirts, sturdy boots, a man who believed in order even when his world had started to fall apart. His wife, Margaret, had been his anchor, the one who had softened his rough edges, made his life feel less like a duty and more like a home. But when she passed, the silence of the house became unbearable. It was a silence that stretched into the empty spaces of his life, filling his mornings, his evenings, the lonely meals at the small kitchen table. At first, he tried to keep himself occupied, fixing things that didn't need fixing, reading old case files he had no business reading, but nothing filled the void. Then came Luna. She had been a 6-month-old bundle of energy, all oversized paws and boundless curiosity, when George's old partner Ray brought her to his doorstep. "You need something to keep you moving, George," Ray had said, his own hair now as grey as George's. "She needs a home, and you need a reason to get out of bed in the morning." At first, George had hesitated. He had never been a dog person. Sure, he had worked with K9 units during his career, but he had never seen himself as the type to own one. But Luna had a way of making herself impossible to ignore. She followed him everywhere, always watching, waiting, as if she had already decided that she belonged to him, whether he agreed or not. And soon enough, he did. Their routine had started simply. Morning walks, rain or shine, down the road, past the old gas station where George would grab a coffee, through the park where they would sit for a while before heading back home. The townspeople came to recognize them, the old man with his devoted dog, and in those walks, George found something he hadn't expected, a reason to keep moving. Luna grew quickly, her once awkward movements settling into the graceful, powerful stride of a fully grown German shepherd. Her coat, a striking mix of black and tan, gleamed in the sunlight. Her eyes, deep and intelligent, never missed a thing. She was loyal to her core, always walking at George's side, slowing her pace when he did, nudging him forward when she sensed his hesitation. And George, he changed too. The quiet house wasn't so empty anymore. There were paws against the hardwood floor, a warm presence curled at his feet while he read the paper, a pair of watchful eyes following him wherever he went. He spoke more now, even if it was just to Luna, and though she never responded in words, she always seemed to understand. But time does not wait for anyone. At first the changes were small, a lingering cough, a slight unsteadiness in his step. George ignored them, unwilling to admit that anything was wrong. He had always been a strong man, a capable man, someone who others relied on. He would not allow himself to become weak. But Luna knew before he did. She could smell it, the sickness creeping into him, the way his scent began to change, faint but unmistakable. She noticed when he stopped walking as far, when he had to pause to catch his breath. She noticed when his hands shook slightly as he reached for his coffee, when his voice, once so firm, sometimes faltered. Then came the day he could not rise from his chair. It had been an ordinary morning, cold but clear. The sun had barely begun to rise when Luna nudged him, her usual signal that it was time for their walk. But instead of standing, instead of reaching for his coat, he remained still. Luna whined, pressing her nose against his hand, nudging him, urging him to rise. But George could only shake his head, his face pale, his body trembling. The hours blurred. He wasn't sure when he had called for help, only that the paramedics arrived in a rush of movement and urgent voices. They lifted him onto a stretcher, the sharp scent of antiseptic filling the air, drowning out the familiar warmth of his home. Luna barked, frantic, pacing beside them, unwilling to let him go. When they carried him to the ambulance, she tried to follow, her nails scraping against the driveway, her ears pinned back in distress. "Someone get the dog back," one of the paramedics muttered. A neighbor, a woman in her 60s named Ellen, stepped forward, hesitating before reaching out to Luna. Ellen had known George for years, had seen him and Luna walking past her house every morning. "It's okay, girl," she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. "He'll be back soon." But Luna did not believe her. She howled as the ambulance doors slammed shut, as the flashing red lights disappeared down the road, leaving behind only the cold silence of an empty home. And for the first time, Luna was alone. Luna did not understand time the way humans did. She did not measure days in hours or weeks in numbers. She measured them in absence, in the spaces George once filled, but no longer did. The first day he was gone, she had paced the house anxiously, her ears pricked for the familiar creak of the door, the low hum of his voice, the shuffle of his feet across the worn wooden floors. But there was only silence. The air had changed. His scent lingered, but it was fading, and that terrified her in a way she could not comprehend. She spent that first night curled by the door, eyes open, listening. Every car that passed outside made her lift her head. Every faint sound of footsteps sent a flicker of hope through her chest. But he did not return. By the second day she grew restless. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but she did not touch the food left in her bowl. She paced between the living room and the door, then the bedroom, where his scent was strongest. She leapt onto his bed, pressing her nose against his pillow, inhaling deeply as if it would call him back. When it did not, she jumped down and sat by the front door again. The neighbors came by, their voices hushed, their faces solemn. Ellen, the elderly woman from across the street, tried to coax Luna outside, her frail hands trembling as she reached out. Ellen had always been a kind but distant woman, someone who had lived alone for years after her own husband had passed. She had soft, thinning white hair, always pulled into a careful bun, and dark eyes that held the weariness of someone who had seen too much grief in her lifetime. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, crouching slightly, her old knees protesting. "Come here, girl." But Luna only looked at her, ears flattened, unwilling to move from her post. Ellen sighed. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to explain to a dog that the man she loved would never return. By the end of the week, George's distant relatives arrived. They were strangers to Luna, a middle-aged man and his wife, their clothes too clean, their voices too sharp. They spoke in hurried, clipped tones, as if eager to be done with the business of a dead man's affairs. The man, Richard, was George's nephew, though he had barely known him. He was in his early 40s, stocky, with greying brown hair and a perpetually furrowed brow that made him look older than he was. He had a practical, detached air, the type of man who had little patience for sentimentality. His wife, Denise, was slimmer, with short auburn hair cut into a neat bob, her eyes a piercing green that missed nothing. She had the expression of someone who wanted to be anywhere but here, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "So, what do we do with the dog?" Richard asked, standing in the middle of the living room as if it were any other property he had to deal with. Denise wrinkled her nose. "We can't keep it, and I'm not dealing with a shelter." Ellen, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped in with hesitation. "She's been waiting for him," she said quietly. "She won't leave the house." Denise sighed. "Well, someone better figure it out because we're selling the place." They didn't bother with goodbyes. They cleared out what they wanted, papers, valuables, things that could be sold. Then they left. The house, which had once been warm even in its silence, felt hollow now, stripped of the life it had held. The door closed behind them with a finality that Luna did not understand. But she did not leave. That night she lay in front of the door again, waiting. By the next morning her hunger had sharpened, but she ignored it. She had made up her mind. If George was not coming back to her, she would go to him. So she left. She had been on that walk 1,000 times. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every turn, every scent that lined the path they used to take together. She passed the gas station, her paws steady even as the wind cut through the town. Sarah, who had come to expect her, watched from behind the counter as Luna trotted past. "She's going again," she murmured. The young boy working with her, Ethan, barely looked up. Ethan was barely 19, lanky, with shaggy brown hair that constantly fell into his eyes. He had been working at the gas station since he dropped out of high school, never particularly invested in anything outside of his music and his old, half-broken truck. "Where's she going?" he asked absently. Sarah sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "To the hospital, same as yesterday, same as every day now." Ethan frowned, glancing out the window as Luna disappeared down the road. "That's kinda sad," he muttered. Sarah didn't respond. She just watched as the dog faded into the distance. Luna reached the hospital before noon. The large glass doors reflected her image back at her as she sat in front of them, ears perked, waiting. Inside, nurses walked past without noticing at first. But then, one of them, Margaret, A woman in her mid-50s with salt and pepper curls pulled into a loose ponytail, her dark skin smooth but lined with exhaustion, paused, glancing out. "She's here again," she murmured to another nurse. Her colleague Jamie, a shorter, younger woman with round glasses and a perpetually tired expression, sighed. "Poor thing," she said. "I heard her owner passed. She's been coming here since—" Margaret's lips pressed together. She had always liked dogs, had grown up with them before hospital life took over. "Has anyone tried taking her home?" Jamie shook her head. "She won't leave, she just sits there." And that's what Luna did. She waited. But George never came out. As evening fell, the automatic doors swished open once, twice. People came and went. Cars pulled up and drove away. Luna remained. When the air grew colder, when the last few visitors trickled out and the hospital lights dimmed, she finally stood, shook the frost from her fur, and turned back toward the road. The way home felt heavier, but the next morning she did it again, and the morning after that, and the one after that. The days turned into weeks. The people in town noticed her now, not just Sarah, not just Ellen, but everyone. They saw the dog that walked the same road every day, the silent shadow searching for something that was no longer there. Some offered food. Others tried to approach, to call her over, to give her shelter. But Luna did not stop. She did not waver, because in her heart she still believed. Daniel had always been an observant man. It was a trait that had kept him alive in the past, an instinct honed over years of discipline and experience. Even now, long after he had left the battlefield, it remained ingrained in him. A quiet awareness of the world around him, a habit of watching, assessing, understanding. That was how he first noticed Luna. At first, she was just another shadow on the road, a blur of movement in the distance as he sipped his morning coffee from the porch. But over time, he began to recognize her pattern. Every day, at nearly the same hour, she appeared, moving with silent determination along the same route, her form lean and elegant, yet unmistakably weary. She did not linger, did not stray, did not beg at doorsteps or rummage through garbage like a stray with no purpose. She simply walked, her head held high, her steps steady, as if following an invisible path that only she could see. Daniel had spent years around working dogs during his time in the military. He knew their discipline, their instincts, their unwavering loyalty. And he could see, even from a distance, that Luna was different from the usual strays that roamed the countryside. She was searching. But what struck him most was her condition. She was thin, her ribs barely visible beneath her thick coat. Though her fur was naturally thick for the cold, it was unkempt, matted in places, no longer holding the shine of a well-cared-for dog. She moved with a quiet resilience, but her eyes, those deep brown eyes that held a story she could not tell, were filled with something more than hunger. They held longing. Daniel was a man in his early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, his body still strong despite the years. His dark brown hair had begun to grey at the temples, and his face, lined from both time and hardship, bore the marks of a man who had seen more than his fair share of struggle. His blue-grey eyes, once sharp with the intensity of command, had softened with age, carrying the weight of memories that he rarely spoke about. After leaving the military, Daniel had chosen a life of solitude, retreating to the outskirts of town where he could be left alone. His cabin was modest, a small wooden home with a sturdy porch, a well-used truck parked outside, and a woodpile stacked neatly along the side. He had spent the last few years in quiet isolation, tending to his land, fixing things that needed fixing, keeping to himself. He did not seek company, and company did not seek him. That was how he preferred it, but now, for the first time in years, he found himself watching someone other than himself. He did not approach Luna at first. He knew better than to rush an animal that had learned to keep its distance. Instead, he observed. He noticed the way she passed by his property each day, but never lingered. The way she moved with a purpose, but never seemed to find what she was looking for. The way she ignored everything around her, except for the house at the end of her route, where she always paused, as if waiting. One evening, as the sky turned a soft grey with the promise of snow, Daniel made a decision. He walked out to the edge of his property and placed a small tin bowl of food near the road, nothing too close to the house, just enough that she might notice. Then he stepped back and waited. Luna came as she always did. She did not stop immediately, but he saw the flicker of hesitation in her step as she caught the scent of food. She paused, her ears twitching, her nose lifting slightly. But then, just as quickly, she resumed her path, as if unwilling to break her routine. Daniel sighed but did not move the food. He let it sit overnight, untouched. The next morning, it was gone. He continued the pattern for several days, placing food in the same spot, a silent offering. And each time, Luna ignored it at first, until she didn't. Until, one morning, he saw her pause longer than before. Until one evening he found her sitting by the food, her body tense but unmoving, as if wrestling with the decision to trust. Slowly, cautiously, she began to eat. She never let him approach. If he stepped too close, she would retreat, watching him with guarded eyes. But she no longer ignored the food, no longer dismissed his presence entirely. It was progress, small but real. Then came the storm. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a deep cold that sank into the bones, unforgiving and merciless. Snow fell in thick waves, coating the world in a heavy silence. Daniel stood by his window, his gaze fixed on the road. He had seen Luna earlier that morning, had watched her pass as she always did, but now as the storm raged on, he felt a rare, unsettling sense of worry settle in his chest. She had nowhere to go. She would not survive the night out there, not in this. He could not force her inside, she would not allow it, but he could offer her something. Moving quickly, he rummaged through his shed, pulling out an old wooden doghouse that had belonged to his neighbour's dog years ago. It was sturdy, but had been left unused for too long. He brushed off the dust, reinforced the roof, and lined the inside with thick blankets. Then he carried it outside, setting it near the trees at the edge of his property, just far enough that it wouldn't feel like a trap. He placed fresh food inside, then stepped away. The snow fell heavier, the wind howling like a wounded thing. Daniel wrapped his coat tighter around himself as he returned to the house, his gaze lingering on the small shelter. Would she come? Hours passed. He did not see her. The worry in his chest deepened, but there was nothing more he could do except wait. And then, just as he was about to turn away, a shadow moved at the edge of the trees. Luna appeared, her form barely visible against the snow, her fur damp and speckled with ice. She stood there, her body tense, her eyes scanning the area. Then, cautiously, she took a step forward. She sniffed the entrance of the small shelter, hesitated, looked around, as if expecting a trap. The wind howled again, and for a moment she seemed to waver between instinct and desperation. Then, with slow, careful movements, she stepped inside. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For the first time since he had noticed her, Luna had chosen to stay. Daniel had never been one to pry into the affairs of others. He had spent years learning how to read people without needing to ask questions, a skill honed from both his military days and his years of solitude. But there was something about Luna, the way she moved with purpose, the way she lingered outside that old house, the quiet determination in her eyes, that made him want to understand. She wasn't just another stray, she was searching, and whatever she was searching for, it was tied to that house. After the storm had passed, the world outside was covered in a thick blanket of snow, the roads slick with ice, the trees weighed down by the weight of winter. Luna had survived the night in the small shelter Daniel had built, but she was still wary of him, still keeping her distance, even though he provided her with food and warmth. She was not a dog that had simply lost her way. She was a dog that refused to leave a path she had already chosen. That morning, as he sat on his porch sipping coffee, He watched as she emerged from the shelter. She stretched, shaking off the frost from her coat, her breath visible in the crisp air. Then, without hesitation, she set off down the road again, just as she had done every morning before. Daniel exhaled, his breath curling in the cold air. He had to know. After feeding his own curiosity for weeks, he finally decided to follow her. He didn't approach her directly. He knew she would bolt if she sensed him too close. Instead, he kept a distance, moving carefully behind her as she made her way through the town. She passed by familiar landmarks: the gas station where Sarah stood behind the counter watching her go, the grocery store where a few townsfolk had come to recognize her routine. No one stopped her. No one interfered. They had all accepted that Luna had a destination, even if they didn't understand it. When she finally arrived at the house, Daniel stopped a few yards away. It was empty. He had seen it before, but now that he stood before it, he took in the details more closely. The white picket fence was chipped and sagging in places, the porch steps worn down from years of use. The windows, once likely filled with warmth, were now dark and lifeless. The for sale sign out front was partially buried in snow. Luna stepped up to the porch just as she always did. She sat down, ears perked, eyes locked on the door, and she waited. Daniel frowned, a strange heaviness settling in his chest. She wasn't just passing by, she was expecting something. He approached carefully, his boots crunching in the snow. Luna noticed him immediately, her body stiffening. She did not growl or retreat, but her eyes, dark and sharp, warned him not to interfere. He stopped a few feet away. "Who are you waiting for, girl?" His voice was quiet, rough from disuse. Luna didn't respond. Of course she wouldn't. But there was something in the way she didn't look away from the door, something in the way she sat there, unwavering, that gave him the answer he was looking for. This had been her home. Someone had lived here, someone she had belonged to. Daniel turned, scanning the neighborhood. The houses around it were mostly occupied, but he spotted one where an older woman was shoveling snow off her walkway. Ellen. He recognized her from the times she had tried, unsuccessfully, to approach Luna. She was bundled in a thick coat, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, her frail hands gripping the wooden handle of the shovel as she worked slowly but determinedly. Daniel walked over, clearing his throat. "Morning." Ellen looked up, startled at first, before offering a small smile. "Morning," she said, her voice thin but warm. He hesitated before nodding toward the empty house. The dog, Luna, she belonged to the man who lived there, didn't she? Ellen's expression softened, and she set the shovel aside. "Yes, George, he was a good man." She sighed, her breath coming out in a puff of white. She was his dog. They were inseparable. Used to see them walk by every morning like clockwork. Daniel glanced back at Luna, who remained frozen in place. "What happened to him?" Ellen's eyes grew distant. "Got sick. It happened fast. One day he was out walking, the next he was in the hospital. Never made it back home." She lowered her gaze. "His family came, cleared the house out, but they didn't want the dog, just left her behind." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Left behind. The phrase struck something deep in him, something that ached with familiarity. He swallowed, looking at Luna again. "She doesn't know he's gone." Ellen shook her head. "No, she's been coming back here every day since, waiting." The weight of it settled over him like the cold that surrounded them. Luna wasn't lost. She was holding on to something that no longer existed. Daniel knew that feeling well. There was a time when he, too, had refused to let go. Years ago, when he had returned home from his final deployment, the house he had come back to had been just as empty as this one. His wife, Claire, had been his reason for leaving and his reason for returning. But life had a cruel way of taking without warning, and the accident that had stolen her from him had left him in a void he hadn't known how to escape. He had spent months trapped in the same loop as Luna, revisiting places she had once been, expecting to hear her laughter, to feel her warmth beside him in bed, to see her smile when he walked through the door. But she never came back, and neither would George. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. "She won't stop," he murmured, more to himself than to Ellen. "No," Ellen agreed softly, "not unless someone helps her find a reason to." The words echoed in Daniel's mind long after Ellen had returned to her house. He watched Luna for a long time, his thoughts warring between logic and something deeper, something personal. He had not planned for this. He had spent years avoiding attachments, avoiding things that might make him feel again, and yet here he was, standing in the snow, looking at a dog that had already lost everything, a dog that was fighting against an ending she refused to accept. And maybe, just maybe, helping her let go was the only way he could finally do the same. That night, as the wind howled through the trees, Daniel sat by his window and made a decision. He would not let her wait alone anymore. The nights had grown colder, the frost thickening over the earth, creeping along the edges of Daniel's porch like silent fingers. The storm had passed, but the chill remained, settling into the bones of the land, making everything quieter, slower. It was on one of these nights, long after the world had settled into darkness, that Daniel first saw her. Luna lay curled on his porch, her body partially hidden in the shadows, her fur dusted with the faintest trace of frost. She was still, her breathing steady, her ears twitching slightly with every sound the wind carried. He had checked the doghouse he had built for her earlier that night, expecting to see her usual silhouette nestled inside, but it had been empty. Now, as he looked down at her from the doorway, something shifted inside him, a quiet understanding, a recognition of the moment for what it was. She had chosen to be here. For weeks, their routine had been the same. She would pass through, stopping just long enough to eat the food he left out for her, but never getting too close. Some days, she lingered longer than others, watching him from a cautious distance, her dark eyes filled with something unspoken, something that Daniel recognized all too well. She was afraid to trust, afraid to let go of the past, afraid that what little she had left could still be taken away. He understood that feeling better than anyone. At first he had spoken to her in quiet tones, nothing more than soft mutterings as he set her food down. He never moved too fast, never reached for her, knowing that any sudden motion might send her running again. He gave her time to see that he wasn't a threat, time to realize that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to be alone anymore. And now, here she was, lying on his porch, a silent offering of trust. Daniel exhaled slowly, stepping outside with careful, measured movements. The wooden boards creaked under his weight, and he saw Luna's ears flick in response. But she did not move. She simply watched him, her amber eyes reflecting the faint glow of the porch light, waiting to see what he would do. He crouched beside her, his breath curling in the cold air, his rough, calloused hands resting on his knees. "You're stubborn, you know that," he murmured, his voice low, almost amused. "Took you long enough?" Luna didn't respond. Of course, she wouldn't. But there was something in the way she stayed still, in the way she didn't flinch when he reached out, that spoke louder than any words could. Gently, carefully, Daniel extended a hand. His fingers hovered just above her head, giving her the chance to pull away if she wanted to. But she didn't. Instead, after a long, measured pause, she leaned into his touch. It was slight, barely more than a breath of movement, but it was there. Daniel's fingers brushed against her fur, feeling the warmth of her beneath the cold. He ran his hand over her head, his touch light, hesitant at first, as if he still wasn't sure she would accept it. But Luna did not pull away. For the first time since George had disappeared from her world, she let someone touch her, without fear. Daniel let out a quiet breath, his hand lingering for just a moment before pulling back. He didn't push for more, didn't try to force anything. Trust, he knew, was not something that could be rushed. He stood, stepping back towards the door, his movements slow and deliberate. He pushed the door open, letting the warm light from inside spill out onto the porch, the contrast between the bitter cold and the inviting glow unmistakable. He didn't say anything, didn't call for her to follow. He simply left the choice to her. Luna watched him, her body still, her mind calculating. The door was open, the inside unfamiliar, but it was warm, and she was tired. For the briefest moment, doubt flickered in her eyes, the instinct to stay outside, to keep her distance, to retreat into the safety of the familiar. But then something shifted. Maybe it was the exhaustion from weeks of wandering. Maybe it was the way Daniel had not forced her into anything, or maybe it was something deeper, something unspoken between them. She took a step forward. Daniel didn't move, didn't react. He simply waited. Another step, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Luna crossed the threshold. She didn't rush inside. She didn't dart in as if afraid the door might close before she could make it. She simply walked, calm, quiet, and unafraid for the first time in a long time. Daniel closed the door gently behind her. Luna stood in the middle of the room, her body tense, her eyes scanning her surroundings. The cabin was small but well kept, the air inside filled with the scent of wood smoke, aged leather, and something faintly reminiscent of coffee. The furniture was sturdy, practical, a worn leather couch, a wooden table, a few framed photographs that Daniel never looked at anymore. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against the walls, filling the space with a warmth that was more than just physical. Daniel watched as Luna sniffed the air, her ears twitching, her tail still held low, but no longer tucked tightly against her body. She took in the space, studying it, deciding whether it was safe. "You don't have to stay," Daniel said, moving toward the kitchen. His voice was steady, casual, as if he weren't speaking to a dog that had spent months refusing to let anyone near her. But the option's there. He grabbed a metal bowl from the counter, filled it with fresh water, and set it down near the fireplace. Then, without another word, he moved toward the couch and sat down, his back resting against the cushions, his eyes tired but calm. Luna watched him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she padded over to the water bowl, lowering her head to drink. Daniel didn't smile, didn't make any sudden movements. But something inside him settled, a quiet, almost imperceptible feeling of relief. Luna had chosen to stay. She did not yet understand what that meant, did not yet know that this was the beginning of something new, but Daniel did. And for the first time in a long, long while, he realized that maybe, just maybe, neither of them had to be alone anymore. The days that followed were quiet, measured by small steps of progress and moments of tentative trust. Luna had chosen to step inside that night, but choosing to stay was another matter entirely. Daniel had seen enough in life to know that healing, true healing, was never immediate. It took time, patience, and the kind of steady presence that did not demand, but simply existed, waiting for the wounded to come forward on their own terms. Luna was still cautious, still watchful. She did not curl up beside the fireplace like a dog who had always known comfort. Instead, she picked a spot near the door where she could keep an eye on both the exit and Daniel. She ate the food he gave her, but only when he was at a distance, as if some part of her still feared that if she let her guard down, she might lose everything again. Daniel gave her space. He did not rush her, did not try to force her into affection she was not yet ready to accept, but he spoke to her, quiet, low words, a habit he had developed long ago with people who had seen too much pain. Soldiers, like him, who had come back from war with wounds deeper than flesh, wounds that could not be bandaged or stitched shut. "You don't have to run any more, girl," he told her one night, sitting on the couch while she lay stretched out on the floor. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling as the wind howled against the cabin. "You've done enough waiting." Luna didn't lift her head, but her ears twitched, listening. Over the weeks, her body slowly regained its strength. The sharp edges of her ribs softened as the food and warmth took hold. Her coat, once dull and rough, began to regain its sheen. Daniel brushed her sometimes, at first only when she was too tired to move away, but soon she began to tolerate it, even leaning into his touch in rare, quiet moments. She still did not sleep in his room, not yet, but sometimes late at night when he woke with old ghosts pressing against his ribs, he would see her shadow near his doorway, keeping watch in her own silent way. But there was still something unfinished between them, a question that lingered in the air whenever she looked at the door. She had stopped pacing as much, had stopped scratching at the wood as if she needed to leave. But Daniel knew better than to assume she had forgotten. She had lived her life with purpose. That kind of purpose did not simply vanish overnight. One morning, as the first signs of spring began to creep through the frozen earth, Daniel made a decision. He grabbed his coat and boots, filling his thermos with coffee before turning to the dog who had become his quiet companion. "Come on," he said simply, nodding toward the door. "Let's go." Luna lifted her head, studying him. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the conflict, as if she knew exactly where they were going. But then, after a long moment, she stood. They walked together, side by side, retracing the path she had taken for months, only this time she was not alone. The town had grown accustomed to seeing Luna, but now, seeing her with Daniel, people paused. Sarah, standing behind the counter at the gas station, pressed her hand against the glass, watching as they passed. Ellen, the woman from across the old house, stepped onto her porch, her expression unreadable. Luna did not stop. They reached the house before noon. The air was still, the world eerily silent as Daniel stood a few feet away, letting Luna decide. She moved toward the old fence slowly, her steps deliberate, her ears shifting forward. She sniffed the air, then looked toward the porch. There was nothing there. No familiar scent, no familiar voice, only emptiness. Daniel watched her carefully, his hands in his pockets, his breath steady. He had not brought her here to force a choice. He had brought her here because she needed to see for herself. For a long time, Luna stood in front of the house. She did not sit like she once had, did not curl up at the doorstep, waiting for a ghost that would never return. She simply stood there, her tail still, her head slightly lowered. And then finally, she turned. She looked back at Daniel, her eyes searching his, something shifting within them, something that had not been there before. And then, with a quiet certainty, she walked toward him. She did not run. She did not hesitate. She simply chose. Daniel let out a slow breath, the weight in his chest finally easing. He reached down, running a hand gently over the top of her head, feeling the warmth beneath his fingers. "Good girl," he murmured. And this time she leaned into his touch, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The world had begun to change, shaking off the weight of winter and unfurling into something new. The once barren trees now bore the first hints of green, tiny buds pressing against the morning light. The air was crisp, but no longer biting, carrying the scent of damp earth and the soft promise of spring. Birds, absent for so long, had returned, their songs weaving through the quiet town. And on the old familiar road, where footprints had once been the only markers of devotion and grief, two figures now walked together, not out of duty, not out of longing, but simply because they had chosen to. Luna was no longer the restless shadow drifting through the town, no longer the lonely figure passing unnoticed through the streets. She walked with purpose, but it was different now. Her stride was steady, her eyes brighter, her tail no longer tucked tightly against her body in quiet uncertainty. She had not forgotten the past. She never would. But she had found something new, something that had taken its place beside the sorrow, belonging. Daniel walked beside her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket, his pace relaxed but sure. He had always been a man of routine, a man who relied on structure to keep himself from slipping into the past. But for the first time in years, he wasn't walking to fill the silence. He was simply walking because it felt right. They had settled into an unspoken rhythm, one that did not need commands or expectations. Some mornings they passed by the gas station, where Sarah would glance up from her counter and offer a small nod of acknowledgement. The first few times, she had watched them go with something like surprise, but now there was a warmth in the way she looked at them, as if seeing something that had quietly healed itself. Ellen, the elderly neighbour who had once watched Luna with a sorrowful understanding, saw them one morning and finally allowed herself to smile. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to be said, but the way she stood on her porch, watching them with eyes that held the wisdom of a long-lived grief, was enough. Some mornings they walked through town, letting the soft hum of life settle around them. Other times Daniel took them farther, to the hills beyond the town, to the quiet places where the world still felt untouched, where the wind carried only the scent of pine and the sound of rustling leaves. Luna took to these places naturally, her paws pressing into the damp earth, her ears twitching at every new sound. She moved not like a dog who had lost something, but like one who had found something new. One day, as they reached the crest of a hill, Daniel stopped and turned to look at her. She stood beside him, her coat gleaming under the pale sunlight, her breath steady. He crouched, resting a hand on her back, feeling the warmth beneath his fingers. "You doing okay, girl?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Luna looked up at him, her dark eyes holding something unreadable. And then, in a motion that was as natural as the changing of the seasons, she stepped forward and pressed her head against his chest. Daniel froze, caught off guard not by the touch itself, but by what it meant. He had never forced her into affection, had never asked for it. Everything she gave freely, on her own time, in her own way. This was not obedience. This was trust. For a long moment, he simply stayed still, his hand resting gently against her side. Then, with a quiet exhale, he murmured, "Yeah, me too." They walked back home together, the sun warming their backs, the road stretching ahead of them not as something to return to, but as something to continue. Luna had not forgotten George. She never would. He had been her first home, her first love, her first reason for walking. But she had found another now. And Daniel, after years of silence, after years of convincing himself that he had nothing left to give, had found something worth holding on to. Two souls, once broken, had mended themselves not by forgetting,